elections in the 12th of April, 35 candidates, and the only thing is certain is that a surprise can come anytime.
Hello, everyone. Today we're turning to look at two really important Latin American countries, both on the eve of elections. They are Peru and Colombia. So we'll get right down to it. I'm joined as ever by Alberto, who, like me, has got a journalistic background, and by Julian, who has more of an analytical, economic analysis sort of point of view. Let's see what we can work out about the likely outcomes in these elections. Alberto, would you like to give us some general background?
All right, thank you, Andrew, and hello, everybody. Well, if something I can say, especially for Peru today, and let's put this in what these predictions is the unpredictability. It's going to come elections in the 12th of April, 35 candidates, and the only thing is certain is that a surprise can come anytime. We're going to do a more in-depth analysis where we're talking around this, but just a couple of things. The main concerns of the Peruvian population today, according to the polls and the news, is rising crime, corruption, the political instability, 8 presidents in the last decades only, and unemployment. So these are the main concerns. 35 candidates. The polls are giving a lead to the two conservative candidates, but most of these polls are based on Lima. But it's really difficult to measure the real popularity when you're looking at the regions of different regions of Peru where 70% of the population lives. And as many media have been saying, the next round, because it's more than certain that it's going to be a second round on this election, is going to be defined by these regions who are going to be the two candidates. So nothing can be said at this moment who is going to be. The surprise on all of this is that the economy of Peru is continue to perform moderately well. It has a moderate good performance, which it shows a little bit the separation between politics and economy in Peru, which is not always the case. The other big country that we're looking today is Colombia. As you say, there are going to be elections in Colombia by the end of May, 31st of May. The definitions there are a little bit more clear. 3 big candidates are competing around that. The surprise is probably the resurgence of the left, with the candidate Cepeda, who is basically from the line of Gustavo Petro, former president, but a huge increase in popularity of Gustavo Petro that is favoring the candidacy of Cepeda. But the conservative Teresa Valencia is surging in the polls, has strong possibilities. And we have also the third in question that is Aspirilla, or Aspirilleta, the right-wing candidate as well, more in the line of Trump. Nobody's going to know what is happening yet, but clearly, these 3 are going to compete for the presidency. And apart of elections, there are big economic and political challenges for both countries. That's a little bit the summary.
Alberto, sorry to jump in, but just to clarify that the candidate is Paloma Valencia.
Paloma Valencia, yes.
Candidate. And there are lots of quite similar names in the lineup of candidates. So she's the Centro Democrático woman. Can I just take a slight step backwards and agree with everything you've said, and warn our listeners that we will be talking a lot about number 3, because both countries we have lots and lots of candidates, of course, but there are 3 that seem to be in for a chance to fight it out at the second ballot, which will be between two rivals. So a lot of the election maneuvering has been which of those three form an alliance to defeat the other one, and how does that all work? And if I can bother you with it, I'll just give you a little bit more on Peru. That we have Keiko Fujimori, the leader of the authoritarian Fuerza Popular, populist, sort of generally right-wing party. She, according to the latest polls, is on 17.3%. The much further right candidate, who you also mentioned, Rafael López Aliaga, is 17.2%, just behind. So basically, they're in a technical tie. And then we have the sort of social democratic centrist center-left candidate called Alfonso López Chao, who's on 7.9%. So what we're saying is that there's a dead heat between the front two candidates. And the question is, will that change? Have you, Alberto or Julian, got any reason for saying it's going to change rapidly? I think you already gave us a bit of a hint about that, but can you tell us any more?
Yes, I will jump in there very quick, Andrew. You have to understand how Peru behave in general, or the structure of Peru. Peru can be divided between Lima and the rest of the regions around. And when you're seeing this, 70% of the population in Peru are living in the regions. And the polls has a lot of difficulties to reach, especially the rural areas or on the farther south, in the farther north, to see where the votes are going. And something that is really important to say is around 1/3 of the voters, according to polls, are still undecided or are saying that are not going to vote for any of the candidates. So that shows a little bit the level of uncertainty that we're having and why difficult it is really to predict who is going to win. Even in a second round, that is going to happen. But the influence of the regions are higher than you think. And I will give you a historical example. Pedro Castillo, who won in 2021, just close to the vote of the first round in 2021. Pedro Castillo was completely unknown, not even featured in the polls. And suddenly surged, just the last week or the last days of the election, surged. And he won the election against Keiko Fujimori. And that has a lot to do with the regional vote. That's a reason why to explain. Also, we have to understand Peru has a high level of informality. There is quite a high inequalities, big divisions that in a way shapes the politics of the country as well. And it's not very easy for candidates that are coming from the traditional elite of Lima, like Keiko Fujimori or the other candidate, sorry, I forget the name of him, Rafael López Aliaga. They are coming from an elite in Lima, white elite, that is not necessarily being accepted, especially in the Andean regions of Peru. This white division is quite strong.
Julian,
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, one thing I think we're saying, and I just want to clarify that if it is what we're saying, it is that the Peruvian left, which many people believe was destroyed by the Pedro Castillo government and its collapse into absolute anarchy, I think we're saying the Peruvian left might not be as dead as people think it's dead, and it might come back, creating a surge around one or two candidates like Pedro Castillo last time round, who are at the moment appearing at support levels of only, a single percentage digit. So the story, we think, is there could be a last-minute switch. It could be predicted by, maybe something going wrong for the two more traditional candidates. And it is possible then that the two people who go through to the second round ballot might not be Fujimori and Lopez Aliaga. There might be a third in contention. And forgive me, I interrupted. You were about to ask Julian a question.
No, that's it. First, I'm going to answer for what you're saying. I agree with you. What we can say is that perhaps we can say that the first round, one of these two candidates, Fujimori or Lopez Aliaga, are going to go to the second round, but not the two of them, regardless the tie. So we can expect a third on the place on this second round. And on this, you quite right mentioned, we have Alfonso Lopez Chao, who is a leftist economist, who has been searching in the polls. We have also Roberto Sanchez, who was a former minister of Pedro Castillo. And both are quite popular in the regions, especially one in the south and the other in the rural areas where Castillo was strong. The third in contestation of this third position is quite funny. Is the comedian Carlos Alvarez, who is more on the right. He's more on with the discourse of anti-crime against the search of crime. He can be seen sometimes as a more a Trumpist in many ways, but it's a populist approach. These are the three who can be in the next round, as we're saying. I would like now to ask a question to Julian. You as a financial analyst and somebody who is looking on investments, why Peru, regardless this chronicle political instability, is continuing being attractive investments in certain areas? How you can see this clearly separation sometimes between politics and economy?
Good question. No, Peru is extremely rich in many many of the raw materials that are consumed. So it's a big commodity exporters that generates a lot of wealth around, and it's a fairly big economy, and actually on a macro level is actually a pretty well run country. It's got, I think, the lowest GDP, so debt to GDP ratio in Latin America, standing at around 30%, which gives it a lot of room, fiscal maneuver to do stuff. And historically has been a big exporting countries to the United States, of course, China, more importantly. Actually, these days, China is by far, as in three times, by far the biggest trading partner for Peru. And that means that it's a growing economy still, and it means it's attractive for investment. Of course, at some stage you had some big private equity firms who were starting to go further into Peru and trying to find new things to invest in beyond just the pure extractive industries, because there was wealth being generated on other things. So I think it's still a very interesting countries, and of course that aside from what the political situation is.
Could I add there that part of it is, I think, and this applies to both Peru and Colombia, is that there are countries that have maintained quite high levels of macroeconomic stability. So growth has been quite predictable, and if you like, monitored and cared for by quite professional central bank officials, again in both countries. So in a sense, that is part of what's allowed the economy to be protected from the everyday political toing and froing.
Anyway, I still think, and I agree with both of you, they are quite interesting in both countries, but still is, I would not say sort of miracle, but it's really, really this kind of and expected relation between the economy and the politics are so separate, especially in Peru, but you can see that in Colombia as well. I agree with you, Andrew. The macroeconomy is normally predictable. I think there are other elements that I would be controversial. We have to also take into account in the economies of both countries that is sometimes the informality. In Peru is 70%, in Colombia is above 50%. So it's quite high level of informality. So the economy behaves in different ways. the parameters are different. On the other side, I think the drug economy is impacting in both countries as well and has certain level of influence, not levels of we've seen in Central America in terms of violence, but with Colombia, yes, but there is a level of influence of the informal economy related with the drugs. I don't know what you see on that element as well.
I've perhaps bored my colleagues with a lot of numbers to do with homicide rates, but I think it has to be said that one of the real drivers of electoral preoccupation is the perception of violence. And I say perception deliberately because actual levels of violence may be quite different. So before this podcast, I had a look at some of the available data on homicide rates, and I looked at the United States, Peru, and Colombia. And the perhaps surprising result is that in the United States in the year 2023, there were about 5.5 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And in Peru in the same year, there were 3.2 homicides per 100,000, meaning that just based on those figures alone, Peru can be a safer place than the United States, which few people would normally comment on. The figures for Colombia are much, much higher and much more dramatic. There are 25.4 homicides per 100,000 of the population. So what I think is happening is that Peru is still, by comparison to the rest of Latin America and the United States, a relatively peaceful country. To the Peruvians, it doesn't feel like that at all because domestic homicide rates have been increasing and media coverage has been emphasizing very high levels of gang violence. So it gets tabloid Peruvian newspapers cover it massively, and the average Peruvian believes there is a real security crisis in the country. I mean, there are real issues with security in the country, but they are perhaps being exaggerated by the news media, and that's part of the election campaign. So the two right-wing candidates are making a big thing about taking direct action, dramatic action to reduce violence, as a lot of other new governments of the right are saying across Latin America.
I agree. Perception makes everything. You know, that plays really well in politics. Having said that, we cannot ignore two things that is happening in Peru that you already mentioned. Domestic violence has increased in Peru, and that is contributing to this perception, as you say. And the other increasing has been another type of crime, from what I read in a report of America's Quarterly, that it says from January to September 2025, there were more than 20,000 reports of extortions, which is up to 29% compared to 2024. And they are based in inside crimes. If you compare on a more global balance, obviously you see that these numbers probably are much lower than compared to other countries. But I think the local population are seeing this as an increase, and it's being used by politicians because of this sense of insecurity. In the case of Colombia, I think the situation of violence is different. The Colombians, in a way, are more used to the to the levels of violence, but there's also a sensation that crime rate has been increased away, yeah, and is being used by the right-wing candidates against Petro. The sense under Petro violence has increased. But yeah, I agree with you. It's paradoxical because we compare this to other regions. Latin America is not as violent as you can imagine in that way, but clearly there is an increase of violence that is perceived by the population.
And in the specific case of Colombia, we know the violence is, if you like, more complicated because it's linked to international criminal cartels, it's linked to illegal mining, it's linked to coca, cocaine. It has all sorts of ramifications. And it has to be said, and for me, this is a bit mysterious. It has to be said that Gustavo Petro's policies against violence have not been very successful. So in some ways, the signs that his popularity has increased a bit is puzzling. He had this incredibly ambitious program of having peace, if you like, negotiated with all criminal organizations at the same time, which he called the program of total peace. And total peace has not succeeded, but there is a possibility that Ivan Cepeda, the candidate from Petro's party, will start a new phase of peace talks if he were to win. And maybe that is something that's making him more attractive electorally. I'm not quite certain what's going on there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Colombia in that way could be very puzzled. But there is one thing that is really interesting to understand a little bit this surge of popularity of Petro, at least from what I read for several political analysts, local political analysts in Colombia. And there is a recent article of less than 4 days ago in America's Quarterly who was talking about this surge. And part of again is the game of perception. What Petro has managed apparently is to make visible all those high regions in Colombia that were forgotten in the past. And this class division, Colombia has been normally invested in certain areas, in certain specific regions for big cities, and infrastructure has been going there. But there are these areas like in the Caribbean region that were forgotten. And suddenly, especially in these last months, Petro has been increasing direct investments in those regions. And for many says, although these are short-term investments, short-term, not a long-term or something that can be sustained in the time because there are no capability sometimes to in the regions, but it's clearly that the level of support from the state to the local governments has increased massively during the Petro's government, and that has been an impact on his popularity. The other element that is saying is, again, everybody is saying that has been simply a political maneuver that is going to create clientelism, but he has increased the minimum salary hugely recently.
Okay? Yes. Yeah.
That has an impact, and from what I read, the right, the local so far has not come with a reply. They cannot go with a response to this kind of actions. And many saying what Petro has managed, regardless that he is highly unsuccessful even in his social policies, he has managed at least to make visible these big differences in Colombia that from now on, whoever is going to be in power cannot ignore because suddenly that has appeared. That's a little bit the explanation. Still, I'm saying it's really interesting to see that the government who just a couple of months ago was very low in popularity. In the last couple of months, has almost doubled his popularity to almost 50%. And it's a good question to say why is happening all of this.
And also bearing in mind what some people say is an iron rule of presidential elections, which is that the incumbent president, the party of power, always loses. Or if you look at the last 20 years in Latin America, whoever has been in power when there are free elections has been booted out. But what we're saying is that in Colombia's case, it is possible that the Petro candidate, Cepeda, will not be booted out, but could stand a chance of winning. And I should just say, according to the latest available polls, Cepeda is really out there in front with 37.5% of voter preferences, followed by Paloma Valencia on 19.9%, and then by the far right candidate, Abelardo de la Espriella, on 20.2%. So we have a technical, if you like, a technical heat between two of the three candidates likely to fighting for getting through to the second ballot. And it looks that Cepeda, I mean, he's more than 10 points ahead. And that's quite a significant advantage. The question will be, can he maintain it through the final parts of the campaign?
That's a big question, and there is going to we have to see also what is happening. I think it's going to be a second round, but anything can happen in any election in Latin America. But I think it's going to be a second round, and if there is a second round, regardless, and probably the most possible candidate who can win. If Valencia goes to the second round, probably she has more chances to compete against Cepeda than Asprilla.
Yeah. And going perhaps a bit beyond the subject of this podcast, whoever wins the elections, either in Peru or in Colombia, will lack an overall majority in Congress. So how policy gets transferred into legislation and action will be very difficult, and will require a lot of coalition building, which interestingly, neither the Peruvians nor the Colombians in recent years have been very good at. Petro's had lots and lots of battles with Congress, comings and goings, and the relationship between various presidents in Peru and Congress has been very, very difficult, hence the very high number of impeachments.
I agree. Just count the numbers. 8 presidents in 10 years is quite a strong number, but shows also how the Congress in Peru, the legislative power, has lost its legitimacy. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest problems that the country is going to have now. And whoever wins, especially in Peru, I agree with you, will need to we need to be some kind of artist to establish coalition levels or consensus levels in a very fragmented country like is Peru. In Colombia, I think.
Forgive me for interrupting again. One of the implications of this, of having lots and lots of candidates and lots of different parties in Congress, is that there is a structural factor creating corruption. Because if you want to get something done in Congress and you have to consider to pull together 5, 6, 7, 8 political parties to get the majority you need in Congress, it is likely that you are also paying some money or distributing some favors to a number of those parties which are basically opportunist. It's something that's happened for years in Brazil, for example, where the idea of presidential coalitionism, as they call it, is that the president pulls in all these people and offers them jobs, sinecures, political advantages of various types in exchange for their support, and that leads to high levels of corruption.
I think corruption is one of the biggest issue that is affecting the, the whole Latin America, but in these polls in Peru and Colombia, especially in Peru, is a high concern for the voters. I know that corruption represents, according to the polls, more than 20% in terms of level of worries that the voters has. Is quite high. I would like to jump a little bit beyond the local politics because, and I will make a question to any of you who wants to jump on this, but how important are these elections, especially Peru, but also Colombia, for the United States, taking into account the new policy of the toll road doctrine?
I'm waiting to see if Julian takes the bait.
The local
Well, it seems that clearly Colombia is pretty important for the US. If we follow the logic, follow the all the things that have been going on. So we first started with Venezuela, which we know what happened there. Mexico was then had intelligence. The cartel were impacted. Panama went back to be neutral from being owned, the ports being owned by a Chinese company. Be neutral, pushed by the United States, of course. Then more recently, you had the story about the DA finding Petro as or putting it under investigation for drug money or drug trafficking or whatever the reason is. And we know that for quite some time that Trump has mentioned Colombia many times over, much more so than, say, some of the other countries. And more recently, there are talks about, the Greater America that includes everything north of the equator, countries of which Colombia is right in the line of interest from the United States. In addition to that, it has a lot of things that interest the United States. So it's already the US still remains, I believe, the main trading partner of Colombia, and therefore, it seems to me that right now, in the same way that we can see the US being interfering all over the place in many countries, politics and businesses, that right now there's probably some action being made in Colombia. What they are, I have no idea, but there's probably a lot of things happening or being preparation or things going on there. So I would certainly think that in a geopolitical context, Colombia is of high importance to the US. Peru is also of high importance to the US in other places, but that goes through, they have a lot of minerals and probably rare metals that lie somewhere in the Peruvian landscape. But it's a much more stable country, macroeconomically speaking, that is, as Andrew pointed out before. But China is its main trading partner by far. We're talking about the export to China, a huge amount of their good, and the US may try to reduce this, but the influence is there, or has been there for quite some time. There's this talk about the development of a port which will be effectively maintained or developed by the Chinese north of Lima, and therefore it's going to be much tougher. It's going to be much tougher to to go in, to interfere within the Peruvian elections or to shift the balance in one way or another. So I would think Colombia definitely is the main target right now.
To reinforce a little bit of what you're saying, Julian, I will add numbers, something that Andrew likes as well. But when we're talking about exports, exports from to China from Peru represent 38%, against only 12% of Peruvian exports are going to the US. So you can see the big difference between the two markets and the importance. The other element that's important, as you say, is the mega port of Chancay. Chancay or Chancay? Andrew, you can
I think it's
correct me.
Chancay.
Chancay. And based on that, but it's not just the infrastructure of this port that has created huge concerns to American militaries because of the possibly military use of that port in the future. But China has huge infrastructure investments in Peru, as you say, especially in mining and also commodities. So has a huge control. I think, although the Trump foreign policy is trying to catch up, they have a difficult time going around that. What are the Americans have been doing? Just at the beginning of the year, they two elements that we will need to take in consideration, and I think any Peruvian government will need to take in consideration, whoever wins, is that Peru, the US are now investing in the port of El Callao to give also military structure around that, and also has declared Peru as a non-NATO military partner, which I think that has to do message one to try to counter-influence the influence of China, who has had military exchanges with Peruvian militaries in the past, but also is part of the strategy of the government of President Donald Trump in order to put a hard hand against drugs and the war against drugs and other policies. So they need military presence going around that.
I agree with what you've both said, but I'd also add that Donald Trump is a politician and he's very aware of how things play on the media in the United States. My feeling is that he'd like to continue projecting the image of hard line against migration and drugs, and that having, if you like, symbolic things to do in Colombia or Peru, backing up that hardline policy would be very good for him. Um, at the moment, of course, we know he's in some significant political difficulty over the role of the US in the Middle East war with Iran. But he does like, if you like, to have success stories to tell.
The local, the local, the local. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say. So yeah, you both know my view. I think the Iran thing is is a distraction to a lot of things that are actually happening on multiple fronts, which are actual wins for the Trump administration. And that we don't want to face for European, we just suddenly have an ally not being so much of an ally, but having a different relationship is difficult in itself. But I go back to the simple idea, if you have an energy crisis, because of the Iranian war, and elsewhere you have the biggest oil reserves, proven oil reserves in the world that you've just taken over in Venezuela. I think that Trump or the administration just met with Delgado recently or something. And then you go, and then the next one is of course Colombia. So one of the things that Colombia did recently is was trying to get out of, of these international disputes, um, uh, ways of dealing with dispute between companies and well, linked to with oil effectively. So and so that goes completely against what I would say the U.S. companies. So I think there will be a lot of increasing uh, presence in Colombia. You're absolutely right with the war on drugs. They talk a lot about it. Again, I'm not convinced it's strictly speaking to do with drugs, the war on the drugs itself, but maybe in other forms. But it does create tensions. And of course, we saw, not so long ago, there were already some action in Ecuador linked to that. And so,
Mm.
again, it's everything's coming together, just encircling the countries in many ways. And I would think that this would be worrisome if I was, if I was in politics in Colombia for the party which is not a pro-Trump party. Of course, we understand some of the situation. The level of violence. Colombia is a really different country to Peru in that sense, as you highlighted, Andrew. I mean, the level of
Mm.
violence, and when we talk about the numbers, homicides, it's just black and white. The two countries are very, very different. And that's why, to some extent, I think for the Chinese, they are not prepared to. Colombia hasn't fallen as the main trading partner of China for quite some time, and for a variety of reasons, but also because I don't think they quite understand how things work there. Why is there such a big difference between, say, Peru and Colombia, and how you deal with some of the situations there. So yeah, I think these times are going to be quite interesting. I will still maintain that Colombia is probably the most under pressure at this moment from the U.S. administration. I'm not sure from the Chinese side how they will maneuver this, or whether what the situation is, because they're on high alert on pretty much every part of the world right now. They need to deal with the energy crisis in Iran. They need to deal with the ramification of what it means for trading partners all over, from their relationship with Russia. They need to deal with the loss of Panama ports. They need to deal with what's going on in Argentina also, because it's a friendly state to the US. They need to understand, if you're a country which is not used to go out of its borders, which to some extent China has been, is fairly recent in its cross-border, in its attitude, and going outside of the immediate neighborhood that they have. You need to focus. And right now, if I was, to play devil's advocate, and I was to look from their point of view, I would try and focus in areas where I'm strong already. So making sure that Peru is not doesn't fly away. And you've already had the warning shot. I mean, there was this scandal in February which led to the fall of the presidency, which was basically, pictures of the president and the Chinese supposedly businessman.
Yeah.
We don't, we have no idea what,
Mm.
no one says who was his name, whether he was actually Chinese or a businessman. It just pictures of someone that could have been a Chinese businessman. Uh, but that's just the first impact. And you probably can feel that there will be some other ones. Interesting enough, when you look at the social media as well, the TikTok is basically almost on the par with the American firms, with Facebook and so on in Peru. However, in Colombia, the American firms are still have the upper hands at this present moment, even though TikTok is coming up. But still, so you have to look in so many so many dimensions these days just to check, cross-check what everyone is doing. But coming back to my initial thoughts, if I were the Chinese, I would probably focus right now on maintaining Peru as as a status quo. It's not going to go. It's going to be a lot more. It's a lot more difficult for the Chinese or for the US to enter the Peruvian landscape simply because of the amount of trade that Peru is doing with China. It's a simple fact of economics. Unless the Americans decide to buy everything, but that that's another that will open some. I don't foresee this anytime. However, Brazil, I think, is the big one. Well, for China, it's important to make sure that Brazil maintains its neutral stance to some extent between China and the US.
Yeah, I agree in all what you both are saying in this. And I think that if there is a place where China is going to continue playing its cards, it's going to be Peru rather than Colombia. Colombia is basically the U.S. turf, and I think the pressure that Trump is putting on Colombia has to do a lot more with control and try to establish certain level of dominance inside the country. It's really interesting anyway that the relations between Trump and President Petro is have improved in the last months. That probably has to do also that the Trump administrations are not talking too much openly of what is going on in the polls in Colombia. Still, I think that the Americans are going to try to go for a more friendly face to them in Colombia. And in Peru, I think they are trying to do relations through the military approach and certain level of investment, putting pressure on the Peruvian government. I think the next president in Peru is going to play a delicate balance between this competition between the US and China, because there is going to be more pressure from both sides in the area. The local, we are getting a little bit quiet on all of this. So let's play a little bit the game that you like a lot, Andrew. Let's see. Let's try to predict what is going to happen. 12th of April, after that, who we seen playing a second round in Peru? Because I don't think we're going to have a president in these elections. But who do you think are going to be the main players in that area?
I would risk, because I'm sure I'll be proven wrong, a second round runoff ballot between Ivan Cepeda, the left-wing candidate, and Paloma Valencia, the more traditional right-wing candidate. And I think that Abelardo de la Espriella, who is the far right, social conservative, ultra Catholic, I think he will be squeezed out of that contest.
The local, I tend to agree with you. And what about Peru? What is your views? Do you think Keiko Fujimori is going to manage to say, okay, the fourth one was the winning, or is going to be another respiration? What is going to happen, or can be happening?
I would
Good and predictable.
I would say that the second round will be between Keiko and Rafael Lopez Aliaga. In other words, that it will be between two right-wing candidates, and that in this case, the Social Democrat Alfonso Lopez Chao, although he may strengthen, I don't think he'll strengthen quick enough to get into the final two. But who knows what will really happen?
Yeah. So that's a little bit the bettings that we are doing. In that, I differ a little bit with you, Andrew. I think Keiko is going to go to second round as well. But I think the Social Democrat is going to go in the second round and probably can establish land. But then to say who is going to be president, I think it's going to be difficult, especially because of the the rise of the percentage of crime in Peru, I think Keiko Fujimori has a strong hand on that.
Yeah.
And Julian, what are your bets on that? The local.
In Peru, yeah, that's a good question between the two of you. Uh, I'm not quite sure actually in Peru. I'll start with Colombia. I think I agree with Andrew. Cepeda, Valencia, and actually I would probably give a win for Valencia eventually.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that's that's my and that's for a variety of reasons and factors, and not least the apoyo from the US. And on Peru, I think it's a lot tougher to know, and also it's a lot tougher to understand how long that person will stay.
Yeah. That's a big question.
We stay in power. But yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, to be honest, I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't know for Peru.
The local. Okay, I think we are just right on time, Andrew and Julian. So one thing that we are going to do for our next podcast is after the elections in Peru, we are going to analyze the results, obviously, in a future episode. Hopefully, we're going to have analysts with us talking about this. But I think regardless who wins in Colombia and Peru, like everything is happening in Latin America, these are exciting times to analyze the evolution of these countries today.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just recently, I think the US announced they made a $500 million investment into a company with rare earth mineral access in Brazil. Things are just moving so fast all over the place. It's quite incredible.
So with this, I think Andrew, you can tell us for a goodbye. So
yes, well, it's goodbye from all of us, and we will of course be following all these subjects very closely to see if we can better understand and perhaps partly predict what's coming around the corner. Bye for now.
Bye.